Hey guys, it's Liv here. In today's video, we're going to be doing a Paradox and Ruin Pokemon tier list for the VGC tier. I decided it would be a good way to get into the January VGC content by just in the off chance that January does add the Paradox Pokemon and the Ruin Pokemon, doing a tier list on all of the Pokemon that are currently banned and trying to see which ones are the best and where everything falls. If you guys enjoy this content and you want to see more, leave a like below and subscribe for more VGC content. We're gonna have a ton of it starting in January. I figured I have to replay through my Scarlet though for a copy for locals, and I couldn't really actually get to the battle spot rating I was at, so I figured may as well delay the next battle spot vid until Saturday. With that said though, let's get started with the tier breakdown. So I will spoil right now, I did put the boxes in their own tier. These are both restricted and they're both miles better than everything else. So I'm not even gonna bother going to this. They literally shatter even Arceus, which is kind of insane. I will say I slept on these both a ton, like a fuck ton. But these are both some of the best Pokemon we've ever gotten in all honesty. Especially Miraidon. This thing breaks so naturally, and it has I think the thing is too, Miraidon I think is slightly more potent with its floor. Like its floor is a lot higher than Miraidon's is, considering the fact that it only has like a couple sets, but those couple of sets really tear. It's like Scarf Specs and then like Calm Mind, Agility, Dual Dance, and then Parabolic Charge, and they're all filthy. I think Miraidon though has a lot more set diversity. You could do stuff like a bulk up 3 attack set. You could do just Bandit, Scarf, Sword Dance, Flame Charge. You could make a lot work in this Pokemon, I think, in my opinion. Even just 4 attacks I think works in Miraidon because its coverage is just a lot better. But they're both really terrifying options. I think as well that one benefit that Miraidon has over Miraidon is I think that a lot of the Paradox Pokemon that pair with it are actually more viable in VGC, and I think we'll notice that as we go through the tier list. However, these two are so uncomparable to everything else on the list. I'm only mentioning these because they're technically Paradox Pokemon. They even have actual code names, which I learned recently. Miraidon is Iron Serpent, and Miraidon is Winged, it's like Winged King or like Winged Crown or something. I have to pull it up, but I literally learned this like the other day, which was kind of insane to think about. It was, let me actually pull it up real quick, 1 second. Yeah, I did just double check. It is Winged King, in fact. I again literally learned this like the other day. I had no idea. I knew they were paradoxes, just no idea that they had actual names. But regardless though, so off the point. Next up we do have Wo-Chien. Now I will say, I think despite the fact that I don't think a ton of these really are like D tier quality, I should have went over this sort of section, by the way. The S tier is basically the Pokemon I think you'll find on like 50% of teams. A tiers are still really good Pokemon, and they're probably still going to be meta defining in some way, shape, or form. B tiers will still get usage, like at least a fair amount of usage. To put in perspective, that fair amount of usage I'm going to classify as the 3.4%. This is what OU's suspect has percentage used to be, at least. I forget what their new one is, but like the OU tier shift usage, I should say. That's what it is. I think it's a pretty fair amount, you know, getting on 3% of teams. That's pretty likely you'll see it in like an hour of playing. C tiers are going to be for very niche stuff, but still fairly good. And D tier is going to be for stuff that, like the YouTuber Pokemon, essentially. These are the YouTuber Pokemon. You'll still find them on a couple teams for people that really want to use them, but ultimately they're the YouTuber Pokemon. And I think that despite the fact that none of these Pokemon are really atrocious, Wo-Chien sadly falls in that YouTuber Pokemon. Or actually, no, I think it's C tier. I think Wo-Chien's actually C tier. This thing gets some decent options. It's kind of hard to kill. You can also spam Snarl, and honestly, with that plus Leech, you're pretty terrifying. There's very few grass types that are really viable. I can think of like a Moongus, Terragrass, Skeledirge, and then like Brute Bonnet, and I can't really name any others, I'll be honest. But maybe someone else can. Wo-Chien, there will be a decent grass option, and it's also a really good ground check. Because stuff like a Moongus, for example, isn't switching in on Earthquake. It's not really taking Earthquake like super well. Wo-Chien would. It would definitely chew Earthquakes. I think Asmon overall, though, is a pretty decent behemoth in terms of defensive utility. Really, if this thing got Synthesis, this would probably be an A tier. It's really genuinely the only thing holding Asmon back, in my opinion. Up next, we do have Chien-Pao. Now, Chien-Pao, I think, is a solid A tier. I will say, I don't have a lot that's going in the S tier, and I think you could make a case for Chien-Pao. However, the 2 Pokemon I do have going in the S tier, I think are miles better than everything else on this list, and we'll get into that in a bit. Chien-Pao still has a lot going for it. 135 speed is incredible outside of Tailwind. This thing also is honestly really obnoxious to switch around, and despite the fact that you can obviously go for Intimidates on this, the Ruination ability, well, not the Ruination ability, the Swords of Ruin ability is here to stay. This drops the defense stat of all Pokemon on the field besides Chien-Pao by 25%, and you cannot switch around this. So it's just a better Intimidate that also, sadly, it does hurt your own Pokemon, but it's still a better Intimidate in my opinion. Overall, though, this thing is an absolute amazing offensive breaker. You got stuff like priority for Ice Shard and Sucker Punch. Think of this as just good, think of this as Weavile, but it's on steroids. This thing has better coverage, better speed stat at 135 instead of 125. The ability never goes away for the defense drop. It's really genuinely an amazing Pokemon, and I think it's kind of absurd. However, I will say there are a lot of good steel types, and I do feel like you would Terra on this pretty easily, at least in VGC, considering there's no Terra restrictions and there's no hope of a Terra suspect. There's a lot of Pokemon that could also potentially redirect this thing and cause a lot of issues, so I don't think it's exactly unkillable. And it's definitely manageable, at least a lot more manageable in VGC than singles. However, it's still a nightmare. A tier. Ting-Lu, I'm going to give this a B. I think Ting-Lu is definitely a really strong ground type. I could see this thing picking up in usage for sure. This will definitely be used in my opinion. I think there's a few ground types that I would rate a bit higher in this list though personally. The ground dark typing is pretty obnoxious. This thing does get a lot of good options such as Whirlwind, Ruination, both of which are very good utility options. Obviously for ground options, you do have Earthquake for one. You also, I believe you have high horsepower. I know that you get you get Bulldoze, which is pretty decent. And then Stomping Tantrum was the other one. You don't actually get high horsepower, but Stomping Tantrum is 100% anyway. It doesn't really matter. I can't really think of any other utility outside of Taunt that would be very useful in this thing. Like, for example, it gets Memento, but why would you want to sack off Ting-Lu? It's such a bulky piece of shit. You can go for I think you get like Curse Body Press sets. I don't know. You don't. Damn, this thing is a little bit woeful as far as setup goes. This could have been a really decent setup option, but overall, I think this will probably land in a more support range. I know that like Blunder did a vid with Band or something for singles, which this isn't a singles vid at all, but I could maybe see Band having some usage in VGC as well, considering this thing does get Edgequake for one, obviously off his Stab Earthquake plus the coverage Rock Slide or Stone Edge, probably Rock Slide in this case, and then you could always go for stuff like Throat Chop, which could be decent, especially for Sylveon matchups, and then honestly, I'd probably just go with 3 attacks and Whirlwind at that point, or 3 attacks Protect. But ultimately, though, I think this will probably be just a really good support piece for teams. I don't think it's going to be a great option as far as defense goes, and we do have better support here anyway. So I think that despite being a decent support option, it'll just get outclassed. B tier. Chi-Yu, one of our 2 S tiers. This thing is going to be a monster on Sun teams. It's going to be obnoxious to take hits from. This is going to be the epitome of a really good Tailwind option too, considering this is the special defense variation of Chien-Pao. They both drop the offenses, and then Ting-Lu and Wo-Chien both drop the offensive stats. This will, in my opinion, be one of the best new Pokemon to come through the restricteds currently. Chi-Yu will benefit a ton off of Sun teams. You could pair this with like Lilycole and it will be a monster. You could pair this with like Murkrow and it will be a monster. It's pretty hard to KO and well, let me phrase, it's pretty hard to take a hit from. And even still, for such an offensive Pokemon with 135 special attack, the ability to drop special defense, and also 100 speed, you'd think this would be a frail Pokemon, but with 55, 80, 120, this actually is fairly bulky, specially defensive. You could definitely make this into a good special defense tank. The typing at Fire Dark is pretty decent. We see this with Sonora being a really good special defensive tank with Assault Vest, so I do think this will be decent. This thing got U-turn. This would honestly, I'd have put it in the box art tier just for sake of, considering this would literally just be the new Incineroar. We saw Incineroar even outclass a lot of box arts in usage, and it was even hitting top 10 when we had the no restrictions on how many restricted Pokemon you could use. So I genuinely do think this will still be a really good Pokemon, probably one of the best. I think there's one Pokemon on this list that could give it competition. And for anyone who might know anything about pre-Season 1 VGC, you probably already know what this Pokemon is, but don't spoil it for anyone in the comments. They still gotta watch the video. With that said though, up next is Roaring Moon, and believe it or not, Roaring Moon is actually also gonna be in the A tier. I will say this is gonna be an incredible Terra option, probably one of the best Paradox Pokemon for offensive Terras, and it has one of the widest varieties in doing so. You can go with Terra Fire on Sun teams, Terra Acro with Booster Energy, Terra Ground to spam Earthquake, or just Edgequake sets in general. Terra Dark is still great to get around stuff like Prankster Thunder Wave. You have a lot of different options here. However, Roaring Moon honestly is a little bit worse than Hydreigon, I think, personally. I think it's just going to get outclassed by Hydreigon, because a lot of these roles that Hydreigon can do, it just does better. For example, you could obviously go with the Stab Terra set, and you know, It's fine. Hydra can go for stuff like Crit Draco, and that's probably better, at least on Tailwind teams, but you could make a case that Roaring Moon would still be viable with the Terror Dragon set. For Terror Dark sets, yeah, I think Roaring Moon has that one, and it's like the one set besides Flying I could actually give it over Hydreigon, but that's because Flying is a set that Hydra never needs to run. However, if we're going for stuff like Steel coverage, Steel or Poison coverage, Hydreigon has a beat because it has the Levitate ability for a ground immunity. For Sun teams, I would argue that despite the fact that Photosynthesis exists, I would actually give it to Hydreigon because you're typically banking off a spread Heat Wave, which it will hit stronger for, on top of the fact as well that you have the ground immunity. So again, I'd give it to Hydreigon there. As far as sets with other defensive typings, I'm trying to think about the stuff that Hydreigon actually runs. But I think ultimately I would give it to Hydreigon, and I think it's sets that it does better despite Roaring Moon having a couple it does that are better than Hydreigon. I would argue that they're so much better, and I don't think that Roaring Moon would hold up. I feel like it's going to be just purely outclassed in the build area by Hydreigon just because they are similar typed offensive dragons. I know that doesn't really have to be the end all be all, but why run 2 4x very weak dragons when you could just run Hydreigon and run some other mon? I don't think it'll be unusable to be fair, and I still think it'll be very good. It's such a potent mon, I think it'd be kind of hard to be unviable, but I do think it'll just get some usage usurped from it because of Hydreigon existing. Up next is Iron Valiant. Iron Valiant's decent. This is going to be a really strong Hork Drive option. Both physical and special offense will be viable, though I think in doubles because of Intimidate being a thing. And by the time this thing gets allowed, stuff like Lander T will probably be in the game. But I do think this will probably be more of a special threat. It gets a lot of good special coverage though, stuff like Moonblast, Aura Sphere, Focus Blast, Shadow Ball. I'm pretty sure this thing gets Thunderbolt as well. You basically are a huge special coverage machine. Yeah, it gets Thunderbolt. Obviously, you can go for Terra Blast if you're really missing a coverage option, but between Grass, Electric, Ghost, Psychic, and then also your stabs, it would be very hard to not find a coverage that you want just off of those moves alone. You even get spread with stuff like Dazzling Gleam too, which is pretty decent for a Terra Fairy set, which already will hit really hard as it is. Overall though, I think this will be a decent Glass Cannon option, which for what it's worth, Glass Cannons are fine in VGC. They're not typically like the best options unless your name is Reggie Alecki and you have such absurd speed. You could potentially boost that even further with Quark Drive, I guess, which would be pretty decent on Iron Valiant to boost a speed set. Overall though, definitely an A tier. Great Tusk, I think this will be an A tier. I think the Great Tusk will be a decent Earthquake option, and I think especially this will just be a really good tanky Pokemon. You could make this work with Booster Energy 4 attacks, you can make this work with some sort of 3 attacks protect set, you can go with some sort of banded option. I think Great Tusk has a lot to offer. Personally, I see this thing working really well on Tailwind teams, similar to Chi-Yu. I think it's going to be Tailwind Sun teams, and I think they'll be running a lot of the same teams, because this is a great option to kill things such as for example, Chi-Yu is really good at massacring psychics for this. You have Chi-Yu, which can, well, I mean, I don't know. I guess they're not very unique in covering each other's threats because they both just cover so much on their own anyway. But I think this will still be a decent rock slide option for Tailwind. On top of this as well, it's really good at KOing things such as Dark types. Also really good at killing. It's really just good at KOing a lot of Pokemon. 131 attack gets you pretty far. With a ground fighting typing, this is 2 of the just best offensive typings in the game. I will say, I feel like of the A tiers, this is so far definitely the weakest, but I still think it's a really good offensive monster in terms of VGC teams going. Ultimately though, I think it's going to get a ton of usage. I think it's going to be on a ton of team cores because it's extremely splashable. You'll probably Terra into ground or fighting on this, and both will be offensively menacing. And especially between Headlong and Rush and Close Combat, very few Pokemon in the sun are going to want to switch around you. Easy A tier. Next up we have Screamtail. Screamtail I think is definitely a B tier. This will be really good on Perish Trap teams in my opinion. It's going to be a great support option in general though. As far as Screamtail goes, I'm not really sure what else it'll run. It's probably going to run like Perish Song, Encore, and then like Protect, and then maybe Psychic Fang just to get around opposing screens. Or you could always just switch out. I think this will be really good with Goth spam personally, and you could typically just, you know, set this up with Goth and just try and install it, whatever teams you want. But ultimately though, I think that Screamtail is gonna definitely be one of the better Perish Song users in my opinion. The 116 speed is amazing. Well, the 111 speed I should say is amazing. You obviously also get some good utility, which stuff like Gengar isn't bulky enough to pull off. And especially on a Sun team, this thing is practically unkillable. Easily a B tier in my opinion. Brute Bonnet. Brute Bonnet's definitely another, in my opinion, it's another A tier. Despite the fact that I think that I had a lot of worries about this thing even being contentious with Amoonguss, I think ultimately they've been calmed in terms of practice. This thing in hindsight is a really obnoxious to kill Pokemon. With the Grass Dark typing, you're actually getting a lot of benefits. For one, you're getting your ground resistance back, and also you're actually immune to Prankster options, which is really valuable. Moose could typically have had to worry about stuff like Taunt, and you'd maybe have to throw a Mental Air Bonnet. Brute Bonnet never has to do that though, because you have the immunity to Prankster, which means you can't get taunted, so you're firing off your spores with no drawback. Also, you have a Stab Sucker Punch off a 127 attack, which can be boosted even further in the sun, which makes you not only a decent tank defensively, but you're also actually a really good offensive monster. And just speaking of the defenses, 111 HP with 99 in both defenses is honestly pretty amazing. This thing is definitely going to be outclassed, I guess, by other Trick Room options, but even still, you could always run this with like a minus speed nature and go with like Spore, Sucker Punch, and then go for just filler options at that point. Probably like a Giga Train and then Protect set, and this will really just carry your team. Easy A tier. Flutter Mane. This is the only other S tier. As I mentioned, the Paradox Pokemon definitely leaned towards the pass set, considering we have one more pass Pokemon, and I will say this is the outlier here. Well, these two are the outliers here, I should say. But Flutter Mane is definitely a really offensive monster. 135 in both special attack and speed is honestly incredible. Despite the fact that it only hits slightly harder than Chien-Pao, one thing that it does significantly outclass it in is definitely the fact that Fairy Ghost is such an obnoxious typing. If we think of it this way, right? What types typically actually pressure Ghost types? It's normal because they have the immunity, that's fine. And then Dark types, which Fairy massacres. You become neutral to Dark. On top of this as well, you still keep 3 immunities to Fighting, Normal, and also Dragon, which Dragon and Fighting are 2 of the best offensive types you could really think of. This is easily an offensive monster. You get some great spread moves such as Dazzling Gleam, and with Terrestrial Choice Specs in the sun, you actually rival Xerneas in damage, which is kind of insane. And I know it seems like a lot to really pull off, but all you need to do is lead Torkoal Flutter Mane and hope your opponent doesn't lead with a slower Weather Setter somehow. And then from there, just click Terra Fairy and Spec Dazzling Gleam will just do the rest. This thing is genuinely a broken piece of shit. And even outside of, let's say, running a spec set, you still have other utility you could go with, stuff like Taunt, for example, and Thunderwave, so you could definitely make this thing work. But ultimately, though, this is easily one of the best options. I would argue the personal best. Besides the box arts, I think it's the personal best. But Chi-Yu definitely does have a lot of team comps it could work on, and I think it's slightly... Despite the fact that it needs slightly more support, I think if you give it the support that it needs, this thing is slightly scarier of an option. Just because the difference being, I think, is one, the fact that Sun has a lot of... Well, I think these are both really good Sun options, but I think the difference being is that with Beat Wave versus Dazzling Gleam, despite the accuracy reduction, you're definitely going to end up boosting your attack, well, your special attack a little bit more than Photosynthesis would, since it's 1.5 from the Sun boost versus 1.3 from Flutter Mane's boost with Photosynthesis. But I think also the other thing going in Chi-Yu's favor is the fact you could also just burn physical attackers with that. So I think you maybe have an argument there, but even still, I would personally rate Flutter Mane as the best on this list, and it's like the best Pokemon that will be in the format once all the Ruin and Paradox mons come, besides Karada and Miraidon, of course, because they're not coming right away. Next up is Slither Wing. Slither Wing is definitely, in my opinion, a C tier. I think this is decent. I will say I was pretty high on Slither Wing before, but someone actually pointed out to me that Heracross is probably just a better option than this. And at first I was denying. I was like, oh, you know, but Slither Wing can do stuff like First Impression. You get a pretty good Bandit option. And Photosynthesis in the sun is really decent. And someone was like, yeah, just run Tailwind Guts Heracross. And I was like, you know what? It's probably right. Honestly, though, this is still a decent option defensively, though. You get some decent bulk. Slither Wing in general is a pretty decent Pokemon, too. With a 135 attack, you get some decent defensive typing with Bug and Fighting, but you're probably going to want to Terra Fire, in my opinion, to try and avoid burns and also just try and avoid your 4 times weakness to flying, especially with potential for Terra Flying sets that could actually run Terra Blast and try and nail you. I've seen a few stuff that's been running it. In fact, I had a team I was laddering the other day with like Terra Blast and Dozo that was running that, and you can potentially try and play opponents there as far as just nailing them. I think so ultimately end up running like a Wisp set with like Wisp Protect and then Morning Sun and then some single stab like Leech Life, or maybe you ditch Morning Sun for like Body Press or Close Combat. Ultimately though, definitely one of the worst Paradox options for VGC, at least. Definite C tier. Sandy Shocks. I think Sandy Shocks is my personal least favorite of all the Paradoxes. I think that you can make a case for this being C tier. Really, I don't know if there's even a D tier. I will say this thing, I think the biggest competition this has is the fact that it ties Lando for speed, for Lando Eye. And I think there's no real reason to run this over Lando Eye, considering its coverage is so dog shit, and you're basically forced into Terra Blast to get anything outside of like ground, electric, and I think steel is what it also gets. Iron, no, it's Sandy Shocks. I was thinking it's iron something because of the fact that it's made of steel. But no, okay, so you get like Discharge or Thunderbolt, you get like Earth Power, Flash Cannon, and then Power Gem. So not the greatest coverage set. Honestly, this thing would have really benefited a lot from not being required to Terra. And I think that there were definitely options you could have given it, but ultimately though, definitely a D tier option for sure. This is definitely the worst Paradox on the list. Iron Treads is definitely gonna get a B tier for me. I think the fact this is such a glass cannon for a ground type is definitely going to hurt it a bit, but the 108 speed is definitely nothing to laugh at. This thing is going to be a really good Earthquake spammer. As far as, well, actually it's 106 speed, my bad, but even still, this is going to be a really good Earthquake spammer in the tier. Great Rock Slide option in Tailwind, and it's going to be really good at flinching teams between that and Ironhead. Ultimately though, I do think that for the ground typing, it's sort of benefited a lot more from having a bit more SPDEF, something that at the very least as well, having a bit better of a defensive typing would have benefited a lot for, since it is a steel type, but ground steel isn't really the best defensive typing. It's passable for sure, but amongst steel type combinations, there are definitely things that would have benefited a bit more. However, steel is pretty good at handling stuff that would handle ground offensive, and ground steel is definitely good at handling stuff that steel would be hit by offensively, such as fire types, for example. But ultimately though, I gotta say, I feel like that just Great Tusk will be a better option than this in every way, shape, and form for VGC, so I'm gonna give it the B tier. This is definitely, I think, pretty comparable to Ting-Lu. This is like the ground type you run for very offensive spreads, this is for defensive, and this is the nice happy medium that will also benefit a lot more from Tailwind. Next up is Iron Bundle, definitely an A tier. This is definitely going to be a really good Terra option. I think that realistically, it's going to be pretty hard to switch around Iron Bundle. And you could totally see, I think if you're running a Paradox Pokemon specifically for train teams, you're running Iron Bundle, Iron Valiant, and then like Pincurchin, or you're running like Iron Hands, Pincurchin, Trick Room. Realistically, that's the way I see it. This will be a decent option though, offensively speaking, with stuff like Hydro Pump. Sadly, this doesn't get Surf, which Surf would have been really amazing, and I think truthfully, Surf might have bumped it up to S, just solely for the fact that it would have gotten a good spread that's not Blizzard and requiring Hail, which I think the thing is that requiring both Hail and Electric Terrain, I think it'll be a bit much on a Pokemon that ultimately is a lot worse of a typing, both offensively and defensively, than Flutter Mane. Freesia really does carry the spawn. It's the only reason this thing actually hits A tier, but it is such a good A tier. It's probably one of the best you could name in the tier. But the 136 speed is pretty obnoxious. You even outpace stuff like Flutter Mane and Chien-Pao with this, which is pretty decent. You're also great at handling stuff such as fires, rocks, etc. that would otherwise handle ice pretty well. So definite A tier. Iron Hands, this is definitely going to be a solid A tier. Really great trick room option, offensively speaking. You have the electric fighting typing, both of which are going to be pretty damning to hit. Ultimately, I think this will be a really good option as far as just replacing Hariyama's role in the metagame, though I will say one thing that Hariyama will have the benefit of is Guts, so I don't think it'll be entirely outclassing, but with Quark Drive, you could definitely go for like some sort of Memento. You could actually probably go for like a Memento Trick Room option with Pincurchin, and then bring in Iron Hands, and then start going for just attacks with 4 attack sets with AV, or even just go with like a Fake Out 3 attack set. I know Fake Out's an attack too, but you're not clicking it consistently. Point being though is this could definitely be an offensive nightmare for teams in Trick Room. 140 attack is nothing to sleep on, especially with 154 HP. It's a really good bulky option with AV, and you'd honestly chew a lot of hits. Easy A tier. Iron Jugulis, definitely a B tier. This will be a decent option, I think, as far as just being an offensive menace goes. 108 speed literally ties mons like Infernape, Keldeo, etc. And with 122 special attack with the Dark Flying typing, this has a lot of benefits, such as being immune to Prankster hits. Also being immune to Earthquake is pretty decent. So I think this will definitely be decent. You have the benefit as well of ignoring stuff like Expanding Force, and you could potentially even make like a Terra Dragon set goes to boost stuff like Dragon Pulse, while also gaining the resistance to fire and playing that mind game still that High Dragon can pull. But ultimately, I think this will just be a pseudo High Dragon, really. I think a High Dragon again is just gonna outclass this thing. So easy B tier. Iron Moth. I think Iron Moth will be decent. It's going to be B tier too, but probably the best spawn in the tier for sure. Fire Poison typing is decent, but having such a bad weakness to ground and rock pretty much mandates that you have to Terra the spawn. Realistically, this does have some good Terra options though. Stuff like Terra Fairy, for example, can help get around the weakness and get a nice Dragon resistance too. Not only this, but you would also be able to boost your Dazzling Gleam, which is pretty decent. You can also go with stuff like Terra Water or Grass to handle ground type hits. So you do have some merit, for example, in going for Terras. And even if you do go with Terra Grass, you could still boost with like Energy Ball, so you're not even required to go for Terra to get that coverage. And this will be a decent option in Tailwind teams too. 110 special attack is pretty decent with 110 speed, I should say. With 140 special attack is pretty decent, and with a booster energy, this will be a nightmare offensively. Definitely the best mon in this tier, but still a B tier for sure. Finally, we have the Iron Thorns. This is definitely a C tier. Honestly, just worse T-Tar, though I did see a team comp running around, weirdly enough. I think it was just a YouTuber team comp, though, that had, like, T-Tar Thorns or something pre-meta. I think it was just to run both, truthfully, but it's honestly kind of an interesting idea because you could boost the Spit F thanks to the rock typing, and this could definitely be a good defensive nightmare. Ultimately, though, I think Electric Rock is just pretty shit typing as far as defensive goes, and this is such a bulky Pokemon with a slow speed set at 71 that's also too fast to be good on Trick Room. Definitely going to be one of the worst paradoxes. I think you'd actually make it, and I'm actually going to make that case. We're going to put it in D tier. Really, this will be carried off a Terrastal, but similar to Sandy Shocks, if you're having Terrastal that hard, it's probably not the best mon. Overall, though, this is my tier list. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this, and if you want to see some more VGC tier lists, let me know down below. I'm going to try and bring some on Sundays. The only reason this week's was on Thursday instead was because the fact that I didn't have my battle spot save ready on Scarlet. So hopefully you guys enjoyed, and if you did, leave a like and subscribe. Shout out to channel members, of course, being Josh, Ultra Player, Mia, Zeke Zero, Nox Nocturnal, and Matt O'Shea. If you want to become channel members today, link to that down below. Also, channel member video is going up on Friday this week. I had a lot of stuff coming up with the holidays, so bear with the delay. Hopefully you guys enjoy, though, and I will see you guys later. Until then, peace out, guys.